For group 3, we had generating test cases. I'm Riley Nelson.
I'm Savannah Dottel.
I'm Caitlin Bourne.
I'm Chandler Childs.
And I'm Samuel Despain.
So what are test cases? Test cases are essentially documented prerequisites, procedures, and post-conditions that are used to test whether a software system meets requirements and correct working conditions. Essentially what this means is test cases are cases where quality is being ensured in the software program.
How to create a test case. This is done by following the steps listed on this slide. First, the tester is able to create an ID for the test case. Next, a scenario or test type is identified to test the software. The tester will then identify the aspect within the software or scenario they would like to test, the conditions and steps to perform the test, and the data they will be testing. Finally, the tester identifies the expected results of the test and then records the actual results or post-conditions of the test once it is performed. So here we have an example of a test case for logging into a social media account. We will start in the far left column with the test case ID. This will help us identify and keep track of this test case. In the next column over, we identify the test scenario. Here we are able to see that we are verifying a social media account login. In the third column, we identify the test cases, or in other words, what we are testing to log into the system. For this test case, we are testing the validity of the username and password for an account. As we go down this column, we see the different variations of test cases being tested. This will help the tester identify exactly what the software does when a user enters a valid username and password, a valid username but invalid password, an invalid username but a valid password, and both an invalid username and password. In the next column to the right, we identify the preconditions for the test case. In this example, it is that the user already has a social media account to log into. Next, we identify the steps needed to test the software. For this test, we simply need to enter a username, password, and click a button to log into the account. Next, we identify the data we are testing within the software, which are the different variations of the test cases. Finally, we identify what we expect the results of the test to be, and then in the last column right, what the actual results of the test are. So we're able to see going from the far left column to the far right column, the different test cases create the different post conditions. So we see in the top row that because the user enters a valid username and a valid password, that the post condition makes it so the user lands on their landing page. Whereas in all the other test cases, because there's an invalid factor, an invalid username or password, the user does not get into their landing page and they are stopped with an error message.
There are many upsides to using test cases. They're beneficial in identifying defects within the software. They also are able to assess the quality of the software by testing the functionality and its current working condition. Test cases also assist in the verification that the software works correctly and in the way it was designed to work. They also make it easier to evaluate test results within software because those results were specifically made for that. The test was specifically made for those results. Test cases are good for testing one aspect of the software at a time. They also provide accuracy, traceability, repeatability, and reusability. Test cases can reduce the cost, the time, and effort of software testing when the tester prioritizes the most important test cases to execute.
The downsides to using test cases first are that not all test cases are created equal. This means not all test cases can detect the same kind of bugs, and some yield results that may not be credible or relevant. So for every test case, it's only going to find one kind of bug. In the example provided earlier with social media login, you can create that test case to test if a valid username and password combination lets the person log in, but that test is not going to find if there's an issue with what the user is able to access once they have logged in. Second, test cases can take a lot of time, manpower, and money to create and execute. So this means that on top of taking the time to develop and engineer and write all of the code for your software, you also have to develop and create and write code for the tests. And third, testers must have a technical background to have and a coding knowledge that is effective for creating the tests. So you need to have someone on your team who knows the system requirements well enough to be able to know what kind of tests will account for every possible scenario and where it can fail. But they also have to have the coding knowledge to be able to then write the code which automatically tests your software so that it can catch all of these bugs. And finally, test cases are not good for testing more than one aspect of the software at a time. You might think it would be more efficient to write one test that could check for multiple things, but if you write a test like that and something fails, you're not going to know where in that process it failed. So this just adds to the time and complexity of writing tests because you need to create one specific test for each very specific use case.
So with that said, when exactly are test cases effective to use? They're effective when they're powerful, meaning if they're highly likely to expose a bug if it's there. They're really effective when they're more likely to yield significant results that are relevant to what we're trying to find and accomplish. They're most effective when they represent events the customer is more likely to encounter, and when they're easier to evaluate, when they're more reliable for troubleshooting, so it doesn't crash in the middle of troubleshooting. If the test cases are more informative with each test, so if you test it multiple times, if it's consistent, it's most effective. It's appropriately complex. It has all the information it needs. It's set up so we can actually collect all the data that we need. They're effective when they help testers and programmers gain insight into aspects of the product, the customer, and the environment.